Chapter 52 of The Portrait of a Lady, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mindy H. The Portrait of a Lady, Volume 2, by Henry James. Chapter 52. There was a train from Turin and Paris that evening, and after the Countess had left her, Isabel had a rapid and decisive conference with her maid, who was discreet, devoted, and active. After this she thought, except of her journey, only of one thing. She must go and see Pansy. From her she couldn't turn away. She had not seen her yet, as Osmond had given her to understand that it was too soon to begin. She drove at 5 o'clock to a high floor in a narrow street in the quarter of the Piazza Navona, and was admitted by the portress of the convent, a genial and obsequious person. Isabel had been at this institution before. She had come with Pansy to see the sisters. She knew they were good women, and she saw that the large rooms were clean and cheerful, and that the well-used garden had sun for winter and shade for spring. But she disliked the place, which affronted and almost frightened her. Not for the world would she have spent a night there. It produced today more than before the impression of a well-appointed prison, for it was not possible to pretend Pansy was free to leave it. This innocent creature had been presented to her in a new and violent light, but the secondary effect of the revelation was to make her reach out a hand. The portress left her to wait in the parlour of the convent while she went to make it known that there was a visitor for the dear young lady. The parlour was a vast, cold apartment, with new-looking furniture, a large, clean stove of white porcelain, unlighted, a collection of wax flowers under glass, and a series of engravings from religious pictures on the walls. On the other occasion Isabel had thought it less like Rome than like Philadelphia, but today she made no reflections. The apartment only seemed to her very empty and very soundless. The portress returned at the end of 5 minutes, ushering in another person. Isabel got up, expecting to see one of the ladies of the sisterhood, but, to her extreme surprise, found herself confronted with Madame Merle. The effect was strange, for Madame Merle was already so present to her vision that her appearance in the flesh was like suddenly, and rather awfully, seeing a painted picture move. Isabel had been thinking all day of her falsity, her audacity, her ability, her probable suffering, and these dark things seemed to flash with a sudden light as she entered the room. Her being there had all the character of ugly evidence, of handwritings, of profaned relics, of grim things produced in court. It made Isabel feel faint. If it had been necessary to speak on the spot, she would have been quite unable, but no such necessity was distinct to her. It seemed to her, indeed, that she had absolutely nothing to say to Madame Merle. In one's relations with this lady, however, there were never any absolute necessities. She had a manner which carried off not only her own deficiencies, but those of other people. But she was different from usual. She came in slowly, behind the portress, and Isabel instantly perceived that she was not likely to depend upon her habitual resources. For her, too, the occasion was exceptional, and she had undertaken to treat it by the light of the moment. This gave her a peculiar gravity. She pretended not even to smile, and though Isabel saw that she was more than ever playing a part, it seemed to her that on the whole the wonderful woman had never been so natural. She looked at her young friend from head to foot, but not harshly nor defiantly, with a cold gentleness rather, and an absence of any air of allusion to their last meeting. It was as if she had wished to mark a distinction. She had been irritated then. She was reconciled now. "You can leave us alone," she said to the portress. "In 5 minutes this lady will ring for you." And then she turned to Isabel, who, after noting what had just been mentioned, had ceased to notice, and had let her eyes wander as far as the limits of the room would allow. She wished never to look at Madame Merle again. "You're surprised to find me here, and I'm afraid you're not pleased," this lady went on. "You don't see why I should come. It's as if I had anticipated you. I confess I've been rather indiscreet. I ought to have asked your permission." There was none of the oblique movement of irony in this. It was said simply and mildly, but Isabel, far afloat on a sea of wonder and pain, could not have told herself with what intention it was uttered. "But I've not been sitting long," Madame Merle continued. "That is, I've not been long with Pansy. I came to see her because it occurred to me this afternoon that she must be rather lonely, and perhaps even a little miserable. It may be good for a small girl. I know so little about small girls, I can't tell. At any rate, it's a little dismal. Therefore I came, on the chance. I knew, of course, that you'd come, and her father as well. Still, I had not been told other visitors were forbidden. The good woman, what's her name, Madame Catherine, made no objection whatever. I stayed 20 minutes with Pansy. She has a charming little room, not in the least conventional, with a piano and flowers. She has arranged it delightfully. She has so much taste. Of course, it's all none of my business, but I feel happier since I've seen her. She may even have a maid if she likes, but of course she has no occasion to dress. She wears a little black frock. She looks so charming. I went afterwards to see Mother Catherine, who has a very good room too. I assure you, I don't find the poor sisters at all monastic. Mother Catherine has a most coquettish little toilet table, with something that looks uncommonly like a bottle of eau de cologne. She speaks delightfully of Pansy, says it's a great happiness for them to have her. She's a little saint of heaven, and a model to the oldest of them. Just as I was leaving Madame Catherine, the portress came to say to her that there was a lady for the signorina. Of course I knew it must be you, and I asked her to let me go and receive you in her place. She demurred greatly, I must tell you that, and said it was her duty to notify the Mother Superior. It was of such high importance that you should be treated with respect. I requested her to let the Mother Superior alone, and asked how she supposed I would treat you. So Madame Merle went on, with much of the brilliancy of a woman who had long been a mistress of the art of conversation. But there were phases and gradations in her speech, not one of which was lost upon Isabel's ear, though her eyes were absent from her companion's face. She had not proceeded far before Isabel noted a sudden break in her voice, a lapse in her continuity, which was in itself a complete drama. This subtle modulation marked a momentous discovery, the perception of an entirely new attitude on the part of her listener. Madame Merle had guessed in the space of an instant that everything was at an end between them, and in the space of another instant she had guessed the reason why. The person who stood there was not the same one she had seen hitherto, but was a very different person, a person who knew her secret. This discovery was tremendous, and from the moment she made it, the most accomplished of women faltered and lost her courage. But only for that moment. Then the conscious stream of her perfect manner gathered itself again, and flowed on as smoothly as might be to the end. But it was only because she had the end in view that she was able to proceed. She'd been touched with a point that made her quiver, and she needed all the alertness of her will to repress her agitation. Isabel saw it all as distinctly as if it had been reflected in a large clear glass. It might have been a great moment for her, for it might have been a moment of triumph, that Madame Merle had lost her pluck and saw before her the phantom of exposure. This in itself was a revenge. This in itself was almost the promise of a brighter day. and for a moment during which she stood, apparently looking out of the window with her back half turned, Isabel enjoyed that knowledge. On the other side of the window lay the garden of the convent, but this is not what she saw. She saw nothing of the budding plants and the glowing afternoon. She saw, in the crude light of that revelation which had already become a part of experience, and to which the very frailty of the vessel in which it had been offered her only gave an intrinsic price, the dry, staring fact that she had been an applied, handled, hung-up tool, as senseless and convenient as mere shaped wood and iron. All the bitterness of this knowledge surged into her soul again. It was as if she felt on her lips the taste of dishonor. There was a moment during which, if she had turned and spoken, she would have said something that would hiss like a lash. But she closed her eyes, and then the hideous vision dropped. What remained was the cleverest woman in the world standing there within a few feet of her and knowing as little what to think as the meanest. Isabel's only revenge was to be silent still, to leave Madame Merle in this unprecedented situation. She left her there for a period that must have seemed long to this lady, who at last seated herself with a movement which was in itself a confession of helplessness. Then Isabel turned slow eyes, looking down at her. Madame Merle was very pale. Her own eyes covered Isabel's face. She might see what she would, but her danger was over. Isabel would never accuse her, never reproach her, perhaps because she would never give her the opportunity to defend herself. "I come to bid Pansy good-bye," our young woman said at last. "I go to England tonight." "Go to England tonight?" Madame Merle repeated, sitting there and looking up at her. "I'm going to Garden Court. Ralph Touchette's dying." "Ah, you'll feel that." Madame Merle recovered herself. She had a chance to express sympathy. "Do you go alone?" "Yes, without my husband." Madame Merle gave a low, vague murmur, a sort of recognition of the general sadness of things. "Mr. Touchett never liked me, but I'm sorry he's dying. Shall you see his mother?" "Yes, she has returned from America." "She used to be very kind to me, but she has changed. Others, too, have changed," said Madame Merle with a quiet, noble pathos. She paused a moment, then added, "And you'll see dear old Garden Court again." "I shall not enjoy it much," Isabel answered. "Naturally, in your grief. But it's on the whole, of all the houses I know, and I know many, the one I should have liked best to live in. I don't venture to send a message to the people," Madame Merle added, "but I should like to give my love to the place." Isabel turned away. "I had better go to Pansy. I've not much time." While she looked about her for the proper egress, the door opened and admitted one of the ladies of the house, who advanced with a discreet smile, gently rubbing under her long loose sleeves a pair of plump white hands. Isabel recognized Madame Catherine, whose acquaintance she had already made, and begged that she would immediately let her see Miss Osmond. Madame Catherine looked doubly discreet, but smiled very blandly and said, "It will be good for her to see you. I'll take you to her myself." Then she directed her pleased, guarded visit to Madame Merle. "Will you let me remain a little?" this lady asked. "It's so good to be here." "You may remain always, if you like," and the good sister gave a knowing laugh. She led Isabel out of the room, through several corridors, and up a long staircase. All these departments were solid and bare, light and clean. So, thought Isabel, are the great penal establishments. Madame Catherine gently pushed open the door of Pansy's room and ushered in the visitor, then stood smiling with folded hands, while the two others met and embraced. "She's glad to see you," she repeated. "It will do her good." And she placed the best chair carefully for Isabel, but she made no movement to seat herself. She seemed ready to retire. "How does this dear child look?" she asked of Isabel, lingering a moment. "She looks pale," Isabel answered. "That's the pleasure of seeing you. She's very happy. Elle éclaire la maison," said the good sister. Pansy wore, as Madame Mel had said, a little black dress. It was perhaps this that made her look pale. "They're very good to me. They think of everything," she exclaimed with all her customary eagerness to accommodate. "We think of you always. You're a precious charge," Madame Catherine remarked in the tone of a woman with whom benevolence was a habit, and whose conception of duty was the acceptance of every case. It fell with a leaden weight on Isabel's ears. It seemed to represent the surrender of a personality, the authority of the church. When Madame Catherine had left them together, Pansy kneeled down and hid her head in her stepmother's lap. So she remained some moments, while Isabel gently stroked her hair. Then she got up, averting her face and looking about the room. "Don't you think I've arranged it well? I've everything I have at home." "It's very pretty. You are very comfortable." Isabel scarcely knew what she could say to her. On the one hand, she couldn't let her think she had come to pity her, and on the other it would be dull mockery to pretend to rejoice with her. So she simply added after a moment, "I've come to bid you good-bye. I'm going to England." Pansy's little face turned white. "To England? Not to come back?" "I don't know when I shall come back." "Ah, I'm sorry," breathed Pansy with faintness. She spoke as if she had no right to criticize, but her tone expressed a depth of disappointment. "My cousin, Mr. Touchett, is very ill. He'll probably die. I wish to see him," Isabel said. "Ah, yes, you told me he would die. Of course you must go. And will Papa go?" "No, I shall go alone." For a moment the girl said nothing. Isabel had often wondered what she thought of the apparent relations of her father with his wife, but never by a glance, by an intimation, had she let it be seen that she deemed them deficient in an air of intimacy. She made her reflections, Isabel was sure, and she must have had a conviction that there were husbands and wives who were more intimate than that. But Pansy was not indiscreet, even in thought. She would as little have ventured to judge her gentle stepmother as to criticize her magnificent father. Her heart may have stood almost as still as it would have done had she seen two of the saints in the great picture of the convent chapel turn their painted heads and shake them at each other. But, as in this latter case, she would, for very solemnity's sake, never have mentioned the awful phenomenon. So she put away all knowledge of the secrets of larger lives than her own. "You'll be very far away," she presently went on. "Yes, I shall be far away, but it will scarcely matter," Isabel explained, "since, so long as you are here, I can't be called near you." "Yes, but you can come and see me, though you've not come very often." "I've not come because your father forbade it. Today I bring nothing with me. I can't amuse you." "I'm not to be amused. That's not what Papa wishes." "Then it hardly matters whether I'm in Rome or in England." "You're not happy, Mrs. Osmond," said Pansy. "Not very, but it doesn't matter." "That's what I say to myself. What does it matter? But I should like to come out." "I wish indeed you might." "Don't leave me here," Pansy went on gently. Isabel said nothing for a minute. Her heart beat fast. "Will you come away with me now?" she asked. Pansy looked at her pleadingly. "Did Papa tell you to bring me?" "No, it's my own proposal." "I think I had better wait then. Did Papa send me no message?" "I don't think he knew I was coming." "He thinks I've not had enough," said Pansy. "But I have. The ladies are very kind to me, and the little girls come to see me. There are some very little ones, such charming children. Then my room, you can see for yourself. That's all very delightful. But I've had enough. Papa wished me to think a little, and I've thought a great deal." "What have you thought?" "Well, that I must never displease Papa." "You knew that before." "Yes, but I know it better. I'll do anything, said Pansy. Then, as she heard her own words, a deep, pure blush came into her face. Isabel read the meaning of it. She saw the poor girl had been vanquished. It was well that Mr. Edward Rosier had kept his enamels. Isabel looked into her eyes and saw there mainly a prayer to be treated easily. She laid her hand on Pansy's as if to let her know that her look conveyed no diminution of esteem. For the collapse of the girl's momentary resistance, mute and modest though it had been, seemed only her tribute to the truth of things. She didn't presume to judge others, but she had judged herself. She had seen the reality. She had no vocation for struggling with combinations. In the solemnity of the sequestration there was something that overwhelmed her. She bowed her pretty head to authority, and only asked of authority to be merciful. Yes, it was well that Edward Rosier had reserved a few articles. Isabel got up. Her time was rapidly shortening. "Goodbye, then. I leave Rome tonight." Pansy took hold of her dress. There was a sudden change in the child's face. "You look strange. You frighten me." "Oh, I'm very harmless," said Isabel. "Perhaps you won't come back." "Perhaps not. I can't tell." "Ah, Mrs. Osmond, you won't leave me." Isabel saw now she had guessed everything. "My dear child, what can I do for you?" she asked. "I don't know, but I'm happier when I think of you." "You can always think of me." "Not when you're so far. I'm a little afraid," said Pansy. "What are you afraid of?" "Of Papa, a little, and of Madame Mel. She has just been to see me." "You must not say that," Isabel observed. "Oh, I'll do everything they want, only if you're here I shall do it more easily." Isabel considered. "I won't desert you," she said at last. "Goodbye, my child." Then they held each other a moment in a silent embrace, like two sisters, and afterwards Pansy walked along the corridor with her visitor to the top of the staircase. "Madame Mel has been here," she remarked as they went, and as Isabel answered nothing, she added abruptly, "I don't like Madame Mel." Isabel hesitated, then stopped. "You must never say that you don't like Madame Mel." Pansy looked at her in wonder, but wonder with Pansy had never been a reason for non-compliance. "I never will again," she said, with exquisite gentleness. At the top of the staircase they had to separate, as it appeared to be part of the mild but very definite discipline under which Pansy lived that she should not go down. Isabel descended, and when she reached the bottom the girl was standing above. "You'll come back?" she called out in a voice that Isabel remembered afterwards. "Yes, I'll come back." Madame Catherine met Mrs. Osmond below, and conducted her to the door of the parlour, outside of which the two stood talking a minute. "I won't go in," said the good sister. "Madame Mel's waiting for you." At this announcement Isabel stiffened. She was on the point of asking if there were no other egress from the convent, but a moment's reflection assured her that she would do well not to betray the worthy nun her desire to avoid Pansy's other friend. Her companion grasped her arm very gently, and, fixing her a moment with wise, benevolent eyes, said in French and almost familiarly,
Eh bien, chère madame, qu'en pensez-vous?
"About my stepdaughter? Oh, it would take long to tell you."
We think it's enough,
Madame Catherine distinctly observed, and she pushed open the door of the parlour. Madame Mel was sitting just as Isabel had left her, like a woman so absorbed in thought that she had not moved a little finger. As Madame Catherine closed the door, she got up, and Isabel saw she had been thinking to some purpose. She'd recovered her balance. She was in full possession of her resources. "I found I wished to wait for you," she said, urbanely. "But it's not to talk about Pansy." Isabel wondered what it could be to talk about, and in spite of Madame Merle's declaration, she answered after a moment, "Madame Catherine says it's enough." "Yes, it also seems to me enough. I wanted to ask you another word about poor Mr. Touchett," Madame Merle added. "Have you reason to believe that he's really at his last?" "I've no information but a telegram. Unfortunately, it only confirms a probability." "I'm going to ask you a strange question," said Madame Merle. "Are you very fond of your cousin?" And she gave a smile as strange as her utterance. "Yes, I'm very fond of him, but I don't understand you." She just hung fire. "It's rather hard to explain. Something has occurred to me which may not have occurred to you, and I give you the benefit of my idea. Your cousin did you once a great service. Have you never guessed it?" "He has done me many services." "Yes, but one was much above the rest. He made you a rich woman." "He made me?" Madame Mel appearing to see herself successful, she went on more triumphantly. "He imparted to you that extra lustre which was required to make you a brilliant match. At bottom, it's him you've to thank." She stopped. There was something in Isabel's eyes. "I don't understand you. It was my uncle's money." "Yes, it was your uncle's money, but it was your cousin's idea. He brought his father over to it. Ah, my dear, the sum was large." Isabel stood staring. She seemed today to live in a world illuminated by lurid flashes. "I don't know why you say such things. I don't know what you know." "I know nothing but what I've guessed, but I've guessed that." Isabel went to the door, and, when she had opened it, stood a moment, with her hand on the latch. Then she said, it was her only revenge, "I believed it was you I had to thank." Madame Mel dropped her eyes. She stood there in a kind of proud penance. "You're very unhappy, I know, but I'm more so." "Yes, I can believe that. I think I should like to never see you again." Madame Mel raised her eyes. "I shall go to America," she quietly remarked while Isabel passed out. End of chapter 52. Recording by Mindy H.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. To volunteer or to find out more information, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Randy Peterson. The Portrait of a Lady, Volume 2, by Henry James. Chapter 53. It was not with surprise, it was with a feeling which in other circumstances would have had much of the effect of joy, that as Isabel descended from the Paris mail at Charing Cross, she stepped into the arms, as it were, or at any rate into the hands, of Henrietta Stackpole. She had telegraphed to her friend from Turin, and though she had definitely said to herself that Henrietta would meet her, she had felt her telegram would produce some helpful result. On her long journey from Rome, her mind had been given up to vagueness. She was unable to question the future. She performed this journey with sightless eyes, and took little pleasure in the countries she traversed, decked out though they were in the richest freshness of spring. Her thoughts followed their course through other countries, strange-looking, dimly lighted, pathless lands, in which there was no change of seasons, but only, as it seemed, a perpetual dreariness of winter. She had plenty to think about, but it was neither reflection nor conscious purpose that filled her mind. Disconnected visions passed through it, and sudden dull gleams of memory, of expectation. The past and the future came and went at their will, but she saw them only in fitful images, which rose and fell by a logic of their own. It was extraordinary the things she remembered. Now that she was in the secret, now that she knew something that so much concerned her in the eclipse of which had made life resemble an attempt to play whilst with an imperfect pack of cards, the truth of things, their mutual relations, their meaning, and for the most part their horror, rose before her with a kind of architectural vastness. She remembered 1,000 trifles. They started to life with the spontaneity of a shiver. She had thought them trifles at the time. Now she saw that they had been weighted with lead. Yet even now they were trifles after all, for of what use was it to her to understand them? Nothing seemed of use to her today. All purpose, all intention was suspended. All desire, too, save the single desire to reach her much-embracing refuge. Gardencourt had been her starting point, and to those muffled chambers it was at least a temporary solution to return. She had gone forth in her strength, she would come back in her weakness, and if the place had been a rest to her before, it would be a sanctuary now. She envied Ralph his dying, for if one were thinking of rest, that was the most perfect of all. To cease utterly, to give it all up, and not know anything more, this idea was as sweet as the vision of a cool bath in a marble tank, in a darkened chamber, in a hot land. She had moments indeed in her journey from Rome, which were almost as good as being dead. She sat in her corner, so motionless, so passive, simply with the sense of being carried, so detached from hope and regret, that she recalled to herself one of those Etruscan figures couched upon the receptacle of their ashes. There was nothing to regret now. That was all over. Not only the time of her folly, but the time of her repentance was far. The only thing to regret was that Madame Merle had been so unimaginable. Just here her intelligence dropped, from literal inability to say what it was that Madame Merle had been. Whatever it was for Madame Merle herself to regret it, and doubtless she would do so in America, where she had announced she was going. It concerned Isabel no more. She had only had an impression that she should never again see Madame Merle. This impression carried her into the future, of which from time to time she had a mutated glimpse. She saw herself, in the distant years, still in the attitude of a woman who had her life to live, and these intimations contradicted the spirit of the present hour. It might be desirable to get quite away, really away, further away than little grey-green England, but this privilege was evidently to be denied her. Deep in her soul, deeper than any appetite for renunciation, was the sense that life would be her business for a long time to come. And at moments there was something inspiring, almost enlivening in the conviction. It was a proof of strength. It was a proof she could some day be happy again. It couldn't be she was only to live and suffer. She was still young, after all, and a great many things might happen to her yet. To live only to suffer, only to feel the injury of life repeated and enlarged, it seemed to her she was too valuable, too capable for that. Then she wondered if it were vain and stupid to think so well of herself. When had it even been a guarantee to be valuable? Wasn't all history full of the destruction of precious things? Wasn't it much more probable that if one were fine one would suffer? It involved then perhaps an admission that one had a certain grossness, but Isabel recognized, as it passed before her eyes, the quick vague shadow of a long future. She should never escape, she should last to the end. Then the middle years wrapped her about again, and the grey curtain of her indifference closed her in. Henrietta kissed her, as Henrietta usually kissed, as if she were afraid she should be caught doing it, and then Isabel stood there in the crowd, looking about her, looking for her servant. She asked nothing, she wished to wait. She had a sudden perception that she should be helped. She rejoiced Henrietta had come. There was something terrible in an arrival in London. The dusky, smoky, far-arching vault of the station, the strange, livid light, the dense, dark, pushing crowd, filled her with nervous fear and made her put her arm into her friend's. She remembered she had once liked these things. They seemed part of a mighty spectacle in which there was something that touched her. She remembered how she walked away from Euston, in the winter dusk, in the crowded streets 5 years before. She could not have done that today, and the incident came before her as the deed of another person. "It's too beautiful that you should have come," said Henrietta, looking at her as if she thought Isabel might have prepared to challenge the proposition. If you hadn't, well, I don't know," remarked Miss Stackpole, hinting ominously at her powers of disapproval. Isabel looked about her without seeing her maid. Her eyes rested on another figure, however, which she felt she had seen before, and in a moment she recognized the genial countenance of Mr. Bantling. He stood a little apart, and it was not in the power of the multitude that pressed about him to make him yield an inch of the ground he had taken, that of abstracting himself discreetly while the two ladies performed their embraces. "There's Mr. Bantling," said Isabel gently, irreverently, scarcely caring much now whether she should find her maid or not. "Oh, yes, he goes everywhere with me. Come here, Mr. Bantling," Henrietta exclaimed, whereupon the gallant bachelor advanced with a smile tempered, however, by the gravity of the occasion. "Isn't it lovely she has come?" Henrietta asked. "He knows all about it," she added. "We had a discussion. He said you wouldn't. I said you would." "I thought you always agreed." Isabel smiled in return. She felt she could smile now. She had seen, in an instant, in Mr. Bantling's brave eyes, that he had good news for her. They seemed to say he wished her to remember he was an old friend of her cousin, that he understood, that it was all right. Isabel gave him her hand. She thought of him, extravagantly, as a beautiful, blameless knight. "Oh, I always agree," said Mr. Bantling. "But she doesn't, you know." "Didn't I tell you that maid was a nuisance?" Henrietta inquired. "Your young lady has remained at Calais." "I don't care," said Isabel, looking at Mr. Bantling, whom she had never found so interesting. "Stay with her while I go and see," Henrietta commanded, leaving the two a moment together. They stood there at first in silence, and then Mr. Bantling asked Isabel how it had been on the Channel. "Very fine. No, I believe it was very rough," she said, to her companion's obvious surprise. After which she added, "You've been to Gardencourt, I know." "Now, how do you know that?" "I can't tell you, except that you look like a person who has been to Gardencourt." "Do you think I look all sad? It's all sad there, you know." "I don't believe you ever look awfully sad. You look awfully kind," said Isabel with a breath that cost her no effort. It seemed to her she should never again feel a superficial embarrassment. Poor Mr. Bantling, however, was still in this inferior stage. He blushed a good deal and laughed. He assured her that he was often very blue, and that when he was blue he was awfully fierce. "You can ask Miss Stackpole, you know. I was at Gardencourt 2 days ago." "Did you see my cousin?" "Only for a little, but he had been seeing people. Warburton had been there the day before. Ralph was just the same as usual, except that he was in bed, and that he looks tremendously ill, and that he can't speak," Mr. Bantling pursued. "He was awfully jolly, and funny at the same. He was just as clever as ever. It's awfully wretched." Even in the crowded, noisy station, the simple picture was vivid. "Oh, that late in the day?" "Yes, I went on purpose. We thought you'd like to know." "I'm greatly obliged to you. Can I go down tonight?" "I don't think she'll let you go," said Mr. Bantling. "She wants you to stop with me. I made Touchette's man promise to telegraph me today, and I found the telegram an hour ago at my club. Quiet and easy, that's what it says, and it's dated 2 o'clock. So you see you can wait till tomorrow. You must be awfully tired." "Yes, I'm awfully tired, and I thank you again." "Oh," said Mr. Bantling, "we were certain you would like the last news." On which Isabel vaguely noted that he and Henrietta seemed after all to agree. Miss Stackpole came back with Isabel's maid, whom she had caught in the act of proving her utility. This excellent person, instead of losing herself in the crowd, had simply attended to her mistress's luggage, so that the latter was now at liberty to leave the station. "You know you're not to think of going to the country tonight," Henrietta remarked to her. "It doesn't matter whether there's a train or not. You're to come straight to me in Wimpole Street. There isn't a corner to be had in London, but I've got you one all the same. It isn't a Roman palace, but it will do for a night." "I'll do whatever you wish," Isabel said. "You'll come and answer a few questions, that's what I wish." "She doesn't say anything about dinner, does she, Mrs. Osmond?" Mr. Bantling inquired jocosely. Henrietta fixed him a moment with speculative gaze. "I see you're in a great hurry to get your own. I'll be at the Paddington station tomorrow morning at 10. "Don't come for my sake, Mr. Bantling," said Isabel. "He'll come for mine," Henrietta declared as she ushered her friend into a cab. And later, in a large, dusky parlour in Wimpole Street, to do her justice, there had been dinner enough, she asked those questions to which she had alluded at the station. Did your husband make you a scene about your coming? That was Miss Stackpole's first inquiry. No, I can't say he made a scene. He didn't object then. Yes, he objected very much, but it was not what you'd call a scene. What was it then? It was a very conversation. Henrietta for a moment regarded her guest. It must have been hellish, she then remarked, and Isabel didn't deny that it had been hellish, but she confined to herself to answering Henrietta's questions, which was easy, as they were tolerably definite. For she offered her no new information. Well, said Miss Stackpole at last, I've only one criticism to make. I don't see why you promised little Miss Osmond to go back. I'm not sure I myself see now, Isabel replied, but I did then. If you've forgotten your reason, perhaps you won't return. Isabel waited for a moment. Perhaps I shall find another. You'll certainly never find a good one. In default of a better, my having promised will do, Isabel suggested. Yes, that's why I hate it. Don't speak of it now. I've a little time. Coming away was a complication, but when will going be back? You must remember, after all, that he won't make you a scene, said Henrietta with much intention. He will, though, Isabel answered gravely. It won't be the scene of a moment. It'll be a scene of the rest of my life. For some minutes the two women sat and considered this remainder, and then Miss Stackpole, to change the subject, as Isabel had requested, announced abruptly, I've been to stay with Lady Pencil. Ah, the invitation came at last. Yes, it took 5 years, but this time she wanted to see me. Naturally enough. It was more natural than I think you know, said Henrietta, who fixed her eyes on a distant point, and then she added, turning suddenly, Isabel Archer, I beg your pardon. You don't know why? Because I criticized you, and yet I've gone further than you. Mr. Osmond, at least, was born on the other side. It was a moment before Isabel grasped her meaning. The sense was so modesty, or at least so ingeniously veiled. Isabel's mind was not possessed at present with the comicality of things, but she greeted with a quick laugh the image that her companion had raised. She immediately recovered herself, however, and with the right excess of intensity. Henrietta Stackpole, she asked, are you going to give up your country? Yes, my poor Isabel, I am. I won't pretend to deny it. I look the fact in the face. I'm going to marry Mr. Bantling and locate right here in London. It seems very strange, said Isabel, smiling now. Well, yes, I suppose it does. I've come to it little by little. I think I know what I'm doing, but I don't know as I can explain. One can explain one's marriage, Isabel answered, and yours doesn't need to be explained. Mr. Bantling isn't a riddle. No, he isn't a bad pun, or even a high flight of American humor. He has a beautiful nature, Henrietta went on. I've studied him for many years, and I see right through him. He's as clear as the style of a good prospectus. He's not intellectual, but he appreciates intellect. On the other hand, he doesn't exaggerate its claims. I sometimes think we do in the United States. Ah, said Isabel, you're changed indeed. It's the first time I've ever heard you say anything against your native land. I only say that we're too infatuated with mere brain power. That, after all, isn't a vulgar fault. But I am changed. A woman has to change a good deal to marry. I hope you'll be very happy. You will, at last, over here, see something of the inner life. Henrietta gave a little significant sigh. That's the key to the mystery, I believe. I couldn't endure to be kept off. Now I've as good a right as anyone, she added with an artless elation. Isabel was duly diverted, but there was a certain melancholy in her view. Henrietta, after all, had confessed herself human and feminine. Henrietta, whom she had hitherto regarded as a light, keen flame, a disembodied voice. It was a disappointment to find she had personal susceptibilities, that she was subject to common passions, and that her intimacy with Mr. Bantling had not been completely original. There was a want of originality in her marrying him. There was even a kind of stupidity, and for a moment, to Isabel's sense, the dreariness of the world took on a deeper tinge. A little later, indeed, she reflected that Mr. Bantling himself was at least original. But she didn't see how Henrietta could give up her country. She herself had relaxed her hold of it, but it had never been her country as it had been Henrietta's. She presently asked her if she had enjoyed her visit to Lady Pencil. Oh, yes, said Henrietta. She didn't know what to make of me. And was that very enjoyable? Very much so, because she's supposed to be a mastermind. She thinks she knows everything, but she doesn't understand a woman of my modern type. It would be so much easier for her if I were only a little better or a little worse. She's so puzzled. I think she thinks it's my duty to go and do something immoral. She thinks it's immoral that I should marry her brother, but, after all, that isn't immoral enough. And she'll never understand my mixture. Never! She's not so intelligent as her brother, then, said Isabel. He appears to have understood. Oh, no, he hasn't, cried Miss Stackpole with decision. I really believe that's what he wants to marry me for, just to find out the mystery and the proportions of it. That's a fixed idea, a kind of fascination. It's very good in you to humor it. Oh, well, said Henrietta, I've something to find out, too. And Isabel saw that she had not renounced an allegiance, but planned an attack. She was at last about to grapple in earnest with England. Isabel also perceived, however, on the morrow, at the Paddington station, where she found herself, at 10 o'clock, in the company both of Miss Stackpole and Mr. Bantling, that the gentleman bore his perplexities lightly. If he had not found out everything, he had found out at least the great point, that Miss Stackpole would not be wanting in initiative. It was evident that in the selection of a wife he had been on his guard against this deficiency. Henrietta has told me, and I'm very glad, Isabel said as she gave him her hand. I dare say you think it awfully odd, Mr. Bantling replied, resting on his neat umbrella. Yes, I think it awfully odd. You can't think it so awfully odd as I do, but I've always rather liked striking out a line, said Mr. Bantling serenely. End of chapter 53. Recording by Randy Peterson.
Chapter 54 of The Portrait of a Lady, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Portrait of a Lady, Volume 2, by Henry James. Chapter 54. Isabel's arrival at Gardencourt on this second occasion was even quieter than it had been on the first. Ralph Touchett kept but a small household, and to the new servants Mrs. Osmond was a stranger, so that Isabel, instead of being conducted to her own apartment, was coldly shown into the drawing-room, and left to wait while her name was carried up to her aunt. She waited a long time. Mrs. Touchett appeared to be in no hurry to come to her. She grew impatient at last. She grew nervous, and even frightened. The day was dark and cold. The dusk was thick in the corners of the wide brown rooms. The house was perfectly still, a stillness that Isabel remembered. It had filled all the place for days before the death of her uncle. She left the drawing-room and wandered about, strolled into the library and along the gallery of pictures where, in the deep silence, her footstep made an echo. Nothing was changed. She recognized everything that she had seen years before. It might have been only yesterday that she stood there. She reflected that things change but little, while people change so much, and she became aware that she was walking about as her aunt had done on the day that she came to see her in Albany. She was changed enough since then. That had been the beginning. It suddenly struck her that if her Aunt Lydia had not come that day in just that way and found her alone, everything might have been different. She might have had another life, and today she might have been a happier woman. She stopped in the gallery in front of a small picture, a beautiful and valuable Bonington, upon which her eyes rested for a long time. But she was not looking at the picture. She was wondering whether if her aunt had not come that day in Albany, she would have married Caspar Goodwood. Mrs. Touchett appeared at last, just after Isabel had returned to the big, uninhabited drawing-room. She looked a good deal older, but her eye was as bright as ever, and her head as erect. Her thin lips seemed a repository of latent meanings. She wore a little gray dress, of the most undecorated fashion, and Isabel wondered, as she had wondered the first time, whether her remarkable kinswoman resembled more a queen regent or the matron of a jail. Her lips felt very thin indeed as Isabel kissed her. "I have kept you waiting because I have been sitting with Ralph," Mrs. Touchett said. The nurse had gone to her lunch, and I had taken her place. He has a man who is supposed to look after him, but the man is good for nothing. He is always looking out of the window. As if there were anything to see! I didn't wish to move, because Ralph seemed to be sleeping, and I was afraid the sound would disturb him. I waited till the nurse came back. I remembered that you knew the house. I find I know it better even than I thought. I have been walking. Isabel answered. And then she asked whether Ralph slept much. He lies with his eyes closed. He doesn't move. But I am not sure that it's always sleep. Will he see me? Can he speak to me? Mrs. Touchett hesitated a moment. You can try him, she said. And then she offered to conduct Isabel to her room. I thought they had taken you there. But it's not my house, it's Ralph's, and I don't know what they do. They must at least have taken your luggage. I don't suppose you have brought much. Not that I care, however. I believe they have given you the same room you had before. When Ralph heard you were coming, he said you must have that one. Did he say anything else? Ah, my dear, he doesn't chatter as he used, cried Mrs. Touchett, as she preceded her niece up the staircase. It was the same room, and something told Isabel that it had not been slept in since she occupied it. Her luggage was there, and it was not voluminous. Mrs. Touchett sat down a moment, with her eyes upon it. Is there really no hope? Isabel asked, standing before her aunt. None whatever. There never has been. It has not been a successful life. No, it has only been a beautiful one. Isabel found herself already contradicting her aunt. She was irritated by her dryness. I don't know what you mean by that. There is no beauty without health. That is a very odd dress to travel in. Isabel glanced at her garment. I left Rome at an hour's notice. I took the first that came. Your sisters in America wished to know how you dress. That seemed to be their principal interest. I wasn't able to tell them, but they seemed to have the right idea, that you never wear anything less than black brocade. They think I am more brilliant than I am. I am afraid to tell them the truth, said Isabel. Lily wrote me that you had dined with her. She invited me 4 times, and I went once. After the second time she should have let me alone. The dinner was very good. It must have been expensive. Her husband has a very bad manner. Did I enjoy my visit to America? Why should I have enjoyed it? I didn't go for my pleasure. These were interesting items, but Mrs. Touchett soon left her niece, whom she was to meet in half an hour at the midday meal. At this repast, the 2 ladies faced each other at an abbreviated table in the melancholy dining-room. Here, after a little, Isabel saw that her aunt was not so dry as she appeared, and her old pity for the poor woman's inexpressiveness, her want of regret, of disappointment, came back to her. It seemed to her she would find it a blessing today to be able to indulge a regret. She wondered whether Mrs. Touchett were not trying, whether she had not a desire for the recreation of grief. On the other hand, perhaps she was afraid. If she began to regret, it might take her too far. Isabel could perceive, however, that it had come over her that she had missed something, that she saw herself in the future as an old woman without memories. Her little sharp face looked tragical. She told her niece that Ralph as yet had not moved, but that he probably would be able to see her before dinner. And then in a moment she added that he had seen Lord Warburton the day before, an announcement which startled Isabel a little, as it seemed an intimation that this personage was in the neighborhood and that an accident might bring them together. Such an accident would not be happy. She had not come to England to converse with Lord Warburton. She presently said to her aunt that he had been very kind to Ralph. She had seen something of that in Rome. He has something else to think of now, Mrs. Touchett rejoined, and she paused, with a gaze like a gimlet. Isabel saw that she meant something, and instantly guessed what she meant. But her reply concealed her guess. Her heart beat faster, and she wished to gain a moment. Ah, yes, the House of Lords and all that. He is not thinking of the lords. He is thinking of the ladies. At least he is thinking of one of them. He told Ralph he was engaged to be married. To be married, Isabel gently exclaimed. Unless he breaks it off. He seemed to think Ralph would like to know. Poor Ralph can't go to the wedding, though I believe it is to take place very soon. And who is the young lady? A member of the aristocracy, Lady Flora, Lady Felicia, something of that sort. I am very glad, Isabel said. It must be a sudden decision. Sudden enough, I believe, a courtship of 3 weeks. It has only just been made public. I am very glad, Isabel repeated, with a larger emphasis. She knew her aunt was watching her, looking for the signs of some curious emotion, and the desire to prevent her companion from seeing anything of this kind enabled her to speak in the tone of quick satisfaction, the tone, almost, of relief. Mrs. Touchett, of course, followed the tradition that ladies, even married ones, regard the marriage of their old lovers as an offence to themselves. Isabel's first care, therefore, was to show that, however that might be in general, she was not offended now. But meanwhile, as I say, her heart beat faster, and if she sat for some moments thoughtful, she presently forgot Mrs. Touchett's observation. It was not because she had lost an admirer. Her imagination had traversed half Europe. It halted, panting, and even trembling a little, in the city of Rome. She figured herself announcing to her husband that Lord Warburton was to lead a bride to the altar, and she was of course not aware how extremely sad she looked while she made this intellectual effort. But at last she collected herself, and said to her aunt, "He was sure to do it some time or other." Mrs. Touchett was silent. Then she gave a sharp little shake of the head. "Oh, my dear, you're beyond me," she cried suddenly. They went on with their luncheon in silence. Isabel felt as if she had heard of Lord Warburton's death. She had known him only as a suitor, and now that was all over. He was dead for poor Pansy. By Pansy he might have lived. A servant had been hovering about. At last Mrs. Touchett requested him to leave them alone. She had finished her lunch. She sat with her hands folded on the edge of the table. "I should like to ask you 3 questions," she said to Isabel, when the servant had gone. "3 are a great many." "I can't do with less. I have been thinking. They are all very good ones." "That's what I'm afraid of. The best questions are the worst," Isabel answered. Mrs. Touchett had pushed back her chair, and Isabel left the table and walked, rather consciously, to one of the deep windows while her aunt followed her with her eyes. "Have you ever been sorry you didn't marry Lord Warburton?" Mrs. Touchett inquired. Isabel shook her head slowly, smiling. "No, dear aunt." "Good. I ought to tell you that I propose to believe what you say." "Your believing me is an immense temptation," Isabel replied, smiling still. "A temptation to lie. I don't recommend you to do that, for when I'm misinformed I'm as dangerous as a poisoned rat. I don't mean to crow over you." "It is my husband that doesn't get on with me," said Isabel. "I could have told him that. I don't call that crowing over you," Mrs. Touchett added. "Do you still like Serena Merle?" she went on. "Not as I once did. But it doesn't matter, for she's going to America." "To America? She must have done something very bad." "Yes, very bad." "May I ask what it is?" "She made a convenience of me." "Ah!" cried Mrs. Touchett. "So she did of me. She does of everyone." "She will make a convenience of America," said Isabel, smiling again, and glad that her aunt's questions were over. It was not till the evening that she was able to see Ralph. He had been dozing all day. At least he had been lying unconscious. The doctor was there, but after a while he went away. The local doctor who had attended his father, and whom Ralph liked. He came 3 or 4 times a day. He was deeply interested in his patient. Ralph had had Sir Matthew Hope, but he had got tired of this celebrated man, to whom he had asked his mother to send word that he was now dead, and was therefore without further need of medical advice. Mrs. Touchett had simply written to Sir Matthew that her son disliked him. On the day of Isabel's arrival, Ralph gave no sign, as I have related, for many hours, but towards evening he raised himself and said he knew that she had come. How he knew it was not apparent, inasmuch as, for fear of exciting him, no one had offered the information. Isabel came in and sat by his bed in the dim light. There was only a shaded candle in a corner of the room. She told the nurse that she might go, that she herself would sit with him for the rest of the evening. He had opened his eyes and recognized her, and had moved his hand, which lay very helpless beside him, so that she might take it. But he was unable to speak. He closed his eyes again and remained perfectly still, only keeping her hand in his own. She sat with him a long time, till the nurse came back, but he gave no further sign. He might have passed away while she looked at him. He was already the figure and pattern of death. She had thought him far gone in Rome, but this was worse. There was only one change possible now. There was a strange tranquillity in his face, It was as still as the lid of a box. With this he was a mere lattice of bones. When he opened his eyes to greet her, it was as if she were looking into immeasurable space. It was not till midnight that the nurse came back, but the hours to Isabel had not seemed long. It was exactly what she had come for. If she had come simply to wait, she found ample occasion, for he lay for 3 days in a kind of grateful silence. He recognized her, and at moments he seemed to wish to speak, but he found no voice. Then he closed his eyes again, as if he too were waiting for something that certainly would come. He was so absolutely quiet that it seemed to her what was coming had already arrived, and yet she never lost the sense that they were still together. But they were not always together. There were other hours that she passed in wandering through the empty house and listening for a voice that was not poor Ralph's. She had a constant fear. She thought it possible her husband would write to her. But he remained silent, and she only got a letter from Florence, from the Countess Gesine. Ralph, however, spoke at last, on the evening of the 3rd day. "I feel better tonight," he murmured, abruptly, in the soundless dimness of her vigil. "I think I can say something." She sank upon her knees beside his pillow, took his thin hand in her own, begged him not to make an effort, not to tire himself. His face was of necessity serious. It was incapable of the muscular play of smile, but its owner apparently had not lost a perception of incongruities. "What does it matter if I am tired, when I have all eternity to rest?" he asked. "There is no harm in making an effort when it is the very last. Don't people always feel better just before the end? I have often heard of that. It's what I was waiting for. Ever since you have been here I thought it would come. I tried 2 or 3 times. I was afraid you would get tired of sitting there." He spoke slowly, with painful breaks and long pauses. His voice seemed to come from a distance. When he ceased, he lay with his face turned to Isabel, and his large unwinking eyes open into her own. "It was very good of you to come," he went on. "I thought you would, but I wasn't sure." "I was not sure either, till I came," said Isabel. "You have been like an angel beside my bed. You know they talked about the angel of death. It's the most beautiful of all. You have been like that, as if you were waiting for me." "I wasn't waiting for your death. I was waiting for this. This is not death, dear Ralph. Not for you, no. There is nothing makes us feel so much alive as to see others die. That's the sensation of life, the sense that we remain. I have had it, even I. But now I am of no use but to give it to others. With me it's all over." And then he paused. Isabel bowed her head further till it rested on the 2 hands that were clasped upon his own. She could not see him now, but his faraway voice was close to her ear. "Isabel," he went on suddenly, "I wish it were over for you." She answered nothing. She had burst into sobs. She remained so with her buried face. He lay silent, listening to her sobs. At last he gave a long groan. "Ah, what is it you have done for me?" "What is it you did for me?" she cried, her now extreme agitation half smothered by her attitude. She had lost all her shame, all wish to hide things. Now he might know. She wished him to know, for it brought them supremely together, and he was beyond the reach of pain. "You did something once. You know it. Oh, Ralph, you have been everything. What have I done for you? What can I do today? I would die if you could live, but I don't wish you to live. I would die myself not to lose you." Her voice was as broken as his own, and full of tears and anguish. "You won't lose me. You will keep me. Keep me in your heart. I shall be nearer to you than I have ever been. Dear Isabel, life is better, for in life there is love. Death is good, but there is no love." "I never thanked you. I never spoke. I never was what I should be," Isabel went on. She felt a passionate need to cry out and accuse herself, to let her sorrow possess her. All her troubles for the moment became single and melted together into this present pain. "What must you have thought of me? Yet how could I know? I never knew, and I only know today because there are people less stupid than I." "Don't mind people," said Ralph. "I think I am glad to leave people." She raised her head in her clasped hands. She seemed for a moment to pray to him. "Is it true? Is it true?" she asked. "True that you have been stupid?" "Oh, no," said Ralph, with a sensible intention of wit. "That you made me rich, that all I have is yours?" He turned away his head, and for some time said nothing. Then at last, "Ah, don't speak of that. That was not happy." Slowly he moved his face toward her again, and they once more saw each other. But for that, and he paused. "I believe I ruined you," he added softly. She was full of the sense that he was beyond the reach of pain. He seemed already so little of this world. But even if she had not had it, she would still have spoken, for nothing mattered now but the only knowledge that was not pure anguish, the knowledge that they were looking at the truth together. "He married me for my money," she said. She wished to say everything. She was afraid he might die before she had done so. He gazed at her a little, and for the first time his fixed eyes lowered their lids, but he raised them in a moment, and then, "He was greatly in love with you," he answered. "Yes, he was in love with me. But he would not have married me if I had been poor. I don't hurt you in saying that. How can I? I only want you to understand. I always tried to keep you from understanding, but that's all over." "I always understood," said Ralph. "I thought you did, and I didn't like it. But now I like it. You don't hurt me. You make me very happy." And as Ralph said this, there was an extraordinary gladness in his voice. She bent her head again and pressed her lips to the back of his hand. "I always understood," he continued, "though it was so strange, so pitiful. You wanted to look at life for yourself, but you were not allowed. You were punished for your wish. You were ground in the very mill of the conventional." "Oh, yes, I have been punished," Isabel sobbed. He listened to her a little, and then continued. "Was he very bad about your coming? He made it very hard for me, but I don't care." "It is all over, then, between you?" "Oh, no, I don't think anything is over." "Are you going back to him?" Ralph stammered. "I don't know. I can't tell. I shall stay here as long as I may. I don't want to think. I needn't think. I don't care for anything but you, and that is enough for the present. It will last a little yet. Here on my knees, with you dying in my arms, I am happier than I have been for a long time, and I want you to be happy, not to think of anything sad, only to feel that I am near you, and I love you. Why should there be pain? In such hours as this, what have we to do with pain? That is not the deepest thing. There is something deeper." Ralph evidently found from moment to moment greater difficulty in speaking. He had to wait longer to collect himself. At first he appeared to make no response to these last words. He let a long time elapse. Then he murmured simply, "You must stay here." "I should like to stay, as long as seems right." "As seems right? As seems right?" He repeated her words. "Yes, you think a great deal about that." "Of course one must." "You are very tired," said Isabel. "I am very tired. You said just now that pain is not the deepest thing." No, but it is very deep. If I could stay—" "For me, you will always be here," she softly interrupted. It was easy to interrupt him. But he went on after a moment. "It passes, after all. It's passing now. But love remains. I don't know why we should suffer so much. Perhaps I shall find out. There are many things in life. You are very young." "I feel very old," said Isabel. "You will grow young again. That's how I see you. I don't believe—" And he stopped again. His strength failed him. She begged him to be quiet now. "We needn't speak to understand each other," she said. "I don't believe that such a generous mistake as yours can hurt you for more than a little—" "Oh, Ralph, I am very happy now," she cried through her tears. "And remember this," he continued, "that if you have been hated, you have also been loved." "Ah, my brother!" she cried, with a movement of still deeper prostration. End of chapter 54.
Chapter 55 of The Portrait of a Lady, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klaus. The Portrait of a Lady, Volume 2, by Henry James. Chapter 55. He had told her, the first evening she ever spent at Gardencourt, that if she should live to suffer enough, she might some day see the ghost with which the old house was duly provided. She apparently had fulfilled the necessary condition, for the next morning, in the cold faint dawn, she knew that a spirit was standing by her bed. She had lain down without undressing, it being her belief that Ralph would not outlast the night. She had no inclination to sleep. She was waiting, and such waiting was wakeful. But she closed her eyes. She believed that as the night wore on she should hear a knock at her door. She heard no knock, but at the time the darkness began vaguely to grow gray, she started up from her pillow, as abruptly as if she had received a summons. It seemed to her for an instant that he was standing there, a vague, hovering figure in the vagueness of the room. She stared a moment. She saw his white face, his kind eyes. Then she saw there was nothing. She was not afraid. She was only sure. She quitted the place, and in her certainty passed through dark corridors and down a flight of oaken steps that shone in the vague light of a hall window. Outside Ralph's door she stopped a moment, listening, but she seemed to hear only the hush that filled it. She opened the door with a hand as gentle as if she were lifting a veil from the face of the dead, and saw Mrs. Touchett sitting motionless and upright beside the couch of her son, with one of his hands in her own. The doctor was on the other side, with poor Ralph's further wrist resting in his professional fingers. The two nurses were at the foot between them. Mrs. Touchett took no notice of Isabel, but the doctor looked at her very hard. Then he gently placed Ralph's hand in a proper position, close beside him. The nurse looked at her very hard too, and no one said a word, but Isabel only looked at what she had come to see. It was fairer than Ralph had ever been in life, and there was a strange resemblance to the face of his father, which, 6 years before, she had seen lying on the same pillow. She went to her aunt and put her arm around her, and Mrs. Touchett, who as a general thing neither invited nor enjoyed caresses, submitted for a moment to this one, rising, as it might be, to take it. But she was stiff and dry-eyed. Her acute white face was terrible. "Dear Aunt Lydia," Isabel murmured. "Go and thank God you've no child," said Mrs. Touchett, disengaging herself. 3 days after this, a considerable number of people found time, at the height of the London season, to take a morning train down to a quiet station in Berkshire and spend half an hour in a small grey church which stood within an easy walk. It was in the green burial place of this edifice that Mrs. Touchett consigned her son to earth. She stood herself at the edge of the grave, and Isabel stood beside her. The sexton himself had not a more practical interest in the scene than Mrs. Touchett. It was a solemn occasion, but neither a harsh nor a heavy one. There was a certain geniality in the appearance of things. The weather had changed to fair. The day, one of the last of the treacherous May-time, was warm and windless, and the air had the brightness of the hawthorn and the blackbird. If it was sad to think of poor Touchett, it was not too sad, since death, for him, had had no violence. He had been dying so long. He was so ready. Everything had been so expected and prepared. There were tears in Isabel's eyes, but they were not tears that blinded. She looked through them at the beauty of the day, the splendor of nature, the sweetness of the old English churchyard, the bowed heads of good friends. Lord Warburton was there, and a group of gentlemen all unknown to her, several of whom, she afterwards learned, were connected with the bank, and there were others whom she knew. Miss Stackpole was among the first, with honest Mr. Bantling beside her, and Caspar Goodwood, lifting his head higher than the rest, bowing it rather less. During much of the time Isabel was conscious of Mr. Goodwood's gaze. He looked at her somewhat harder than he usually looked in public, while the others had fixed their eyes upon the churchyard turf. But she never let him see that she saw him. She thought of him only to wonder that he was still in England. She found she had taken for granted that after accompanying Ralph to Gardencourt he had gone away. She remembered how little it was a country that pleased him. He was there, however, very distinctly there, and something in his attitude seemed to say that he was there with a complex intention. She wouldn't meet his eyes, though there was doubtless sympathy in them. He made her rather uneasy. With the dispersal of the little group he disappeared, and the only person who came to speak to her, though several spoke to Mrs. Touchett, was Henrietta Stackpole. Henrietta had been crying. Ralph had said to Isabel that he hoped she would remain at Gardencourt, and she made no immediate motion to leave the place. She said to herself that it was but common charity to stay a little with her aunt. It was fortunate she had so good a formula, otherwise she might have been greatly in want of one. Her errand was over. She had done what she had left her husband to do. She had a husband in a foreign city, counting the hours of her absence. In such a case, one needed an excellent motive. He was not one of the best husbands, but that didn't alter the case. Certain obligations were involved in the very fact of marriage, and were quite independent of the quantity of enjoyment extracted from it. Isabel thought of her husband as little as might be, but now that she was at a distance, beyond its spell, she thought with a kind of spiritual shudder of Rome. There was a penetrating chill in the image, and she drew back into the deepest shade of Gardencourt. She lived from day to day, postponing, closing her eyes, trying not to think. She knew she must decide, but she decided nothing. Her coming itself had not been a decision. On that occasion she had simply started. Osmond gave no sound, and now evidently would give none. He would leave it all to her. From Pansy she heard nothing, but that was very simple. Her father had told her not to write. Mrs. Touchett accepted Isabel's company, but offered her no assistance. She appeared to be absorbed in considering, without enthusiasm but with perfect lucidity, the new conveniences of her own situation. Mrs. Touchett was not an optimist, but even from painful occurrences she managed to extract a certain utility. This consisted in the reflection that, after all, such things happen to other people, and not to herself. Death was disagreeable, but in this case it was her son's death, not her own. She had never flattered herself that her own would be disagreeable to anyone but Mrs. Touchett. She was better off than poor Ralph, who had left all the commodities of life behind him, and indeed all the security, since the worst of dying was, to Mrs. Touchett's mind, that it exposed one to be taken advantage of. For herself she was on the spot. There was nothing so good as that. She made known to Isabel very punctually, it was the evening her son was buried, several of Ralph's testamentary arrangements. He had told her everything, had consulted her about everything. He left her no money. Of course she had no need of money. He left her the furniture of Gardencourt, exclusive of the pictures and books, and the use of the place for a year, after which it was to be sold. The money produced by the sale was to constitute an endowment for a hospital for poor persons suffering from the malady of which he died, and of this portion of the will Lord Warburton was appointed executor. The rest of his property, which was to be withdrawn from the bank, was disposed of in various bequests, several of them to those cousins in Vermont to whom his father had already been so bountiful. Then there were a number of small legacies. "Some of them are extremely peculiar," said Mrs. Touchett. "He has left considerable sums to persons I never heard of. He gave me a list, and I asked then who some of them were, and he told me they were people who at various times had seemed to like him. Apparently he thought you didn't like him, for he hasn't left you a penny. It was his opinion that you had been handsomely treated by his father, which I'm bound to say I think you were, though I don't mean that I ever heard him complain of it. The pictures are to be dispersed. He has distributed them about, one by one, as little keepsakes. The most valuable of the collection goes to Lord Warburton. And what do you think he has done with his library? It sounds like a practical joke. He has left it to your friend Miss Stackpole, in recognition of her services to literature. Does he mean her following him up from Rome? Was that a service to literature? It contains a great many rare and valuable books, and as she can't carry it about the world in her trunk, he recommends her to sell it at auction. She will sell it, of course, at Christie's, and with the proceeds she'll set up a newspaper. Will that be a service to literature? This question Isabel forbore to answer, as it exceeded the little interrogatory to which she had deemed it necessary to submit on her arrival. Besides, she had never been less interested in literature than today, as she found when she occasionally took down from the shelf one of the rare and valuable volumes of which Mrs. Touchett had spoken. She was quite unable to read. Her attention had never been so little at her command. One afternoon, in the library, about a week after the ceremony in the churchyard, she was trying to fix it for an hour, but her eyes often wandered from the book in her hand to the open window, which looked down the long avenue. It was in this way that she saw a modest vehicle approach the door and perceived Lord Warburton sitting, in a rather uncomfortable attitude, in a corner of it. He had always had a high standard of courtesy, and it was therefore not remarkable, under these circumstances, that he should have taken the trouble to come down from London to call on Mrs. Touchett. It was, of course, Mrs. Touchett he had come to see, and not Mrs. Osmond, and to prove to herself the validity of this thesis, Isabel presently stepped out of the house and wandered away into the park. Since her arrival at Gardencourt, she had been but little out of doors, the weather being unfavourable for visiting the grounds. This evening, however, was fine, and at first it struck her as a happy thought to have come out. The theory I have just mentioned was plausible enough, but it brought her little rest, and if you had seen her pacing about, you would have said she had a bad conscience. She was not pacified when at the end of a quarter of an hour, finding herself in view of the house, she saw Mrs. Touchett emerge from the portico, accompanied by her visitor. Her aunt had evidently proposed to Lord Warburton that they should come in search of her. She was in no humour for visitors, and, if she had had a chance, would have drawn back behind one of the great trees. But she saw she had been seen, and that nothing was left her but to advance. As the lawn at Gardencourt was a vast expanse, this took some time, during which she observed that, as he walked beside his hostess, Lord Warburton kept his hands rather stiffly behind him, and his eyes upon the ground. Both persons, apparently, were silent, but Mrs. Touchett's thin little glance, as she directed it towards Isabel, had even at a distance an expression. It seemed to say with cutting sharpness, "Here's the eminently amenable nobleman you might have married." When Lord Warburton lifted his own eyes, however, that was not what they said. They only said, "This is rather awkward, you know, and I depend upon you to help me." He was very grave, very proper, and for the first time since Isabel had known him, greeted her without a smile. Even in his days of distress he had always begun with a smile. He looked extremely self-conscious. "Lord Warburton has been so good as to come out to see me," said Mrs. Touchett. "He tells me he didn't know you were still here. I know he's an old friend of yours, and as I was told you were not in the house, I brought him out to see for himself." "Oh, I saw there was a good train at 6:40. That would get me back in time for dinner," Mrs. Touchett's companion rather irrelevantly explained. "I'm so glad to find you've not gone." "I'm not here for long, you know," Isabel said with a certain eagerness. "I suppose not, but I hope it's for some weeks. You came to England sooner than you thought." "Yes, I came very suddenly." Mrs. Touchett turned away as if she were looking at the condition of the grounds, which indeed was not what it should be, while Lord Warburton hesitated a little. Isabel fancied he had been on the point of asking about her husband, rather confusedly, and then had checked himself. He continued immitigably grave, either because he thought it becoming in a place over which death had just passed, or for more personal reasons. If he was conscious of personal reasons, it was very fortunate that he had the cover of the former motive. He could make the most of that. Isabel thought of all this. It was not that his face was sad, for that was another matter, but it was strangely inexpressive. "My sisters would have been so glad to come if they had known you were still here, if they had thought you would see them," Lord Warburton went on. "Do kindly let them see you before you leave England." "It would give me great pleasure. I have such a friendly recollection of them." "I don't know whether you would come to Lockleigh for a day or two. You know there's always that old promise," and his lordship coloured a little as he made this suggestion, which gave his face a somewhat more familiar air. "Perhaps I'm not right in saying that just now. Of course you're not thinking of visiting. But I meant what would hardly be a visit. My sisters are to be at Lockleigh at Whitsuntide for 5 days, and if you could come then, as you say you're not going to be very long in England, I would see that there should be literally no one else." Isabel wondered if not even the young lady he was to marry would be there with her mamma, but she did not express this idea. "Thank you extremely," she contented herself with saying. "I'm afraid I hardly know about Whitsuntide." "But I have your promise, haven't I, for some other time?" There was an interrogation in this, but Isabel let it pass. She looked at her interlocutor a moment, and the result of her observation was that, as had happened before, she felt sorry for him. "Take care you don't miss your train," she said. And then she added, "I wish you every happiness." He blushed again, more than before, and he looked at his watch. "Ah, yes, 6:40. I haven't much time, but I have a fly at the door. Thank you very much." It was not apparent whether the thanks applied to her having reminded him of his train, or to the more sentimental remark. "Good-bye, Mrs. Osmond. Good-bye." He shook hands with her, without meeting her eyes, and then he turned to Mrs. Touchett, who had wandered back to them. With her his parting was equally brief, and in a moment the two ladies saw him move with long steps across the lawn. "Are you very sure he's to be married?" Isabel asked of her aunt. "I can't be surer than he, but he seems sure. I congratulated him, and he accepted it." "Ah," said Isabel, "I give it up," while her aunt returned to the house and to those avocations which the visitor had interrupted. She gave it up, but she still thought of it while she strolled again under the great oaks whose shadows were long upon the acres of turf. At the end of a few minutes she found herself near a rustic bench, which, a moment after she had looked at it, struck her as an object recognized. It was not simply that she had seen it before, nor even that she had sat upon it. It was that on this spot something important had happened to her, that the place had an air of association. Then she remembered that she had been sitting there 6 years before, when a servant brought her from the house the letter in which Caspar Goodwood informed her that he had followed her to Europe, and that when she had read the letter she looked up to hear Lord Warburton announcing that he should like to marry her. It was indeed an historical and interesting bench. She stood and looked at it as if it might have something to say to her. She wouldn't sit down on it now. She felt rather afraid of it. She only stood before it, and while she stood, the past came back to her in one of those rushing waves of emotion by which persons of sensibility are visited at odd hours. The effect of this agitation was a sudden sense of being very tired, under the influence of which she overcame her scruples and sank into the rustic seat. I have said that she was restless and unable to occupy herself, and whether or no, if you had seen her there, you would have admired the justice of the former epithet. you would at least have allowed that at this moment she was the image of a victim of idleness. Her attitude had a singular absence of purpose. Her hands, hanging at her sides, lost themselves in the folds of her black dress. Her eyes gazed vaguely before her. There was nothing to recall her to the house. The two ladies, in their seclusion, dined early and had tea at an indefinite hour. How long she had sat in this position she could not have told you, but the twilight had grown thick when she became aware that she was not alone. She quickly straightened herself, glancing about, and then saw what had become of her solitude. She was sharing it with Caspar Goodwood, who stood looking at her a few yards off, and whose footfall on the unresonant turf, as he came near, she had not heard. It occurred to her in the midst of this that it was just so Lord Warburton had surprised her of old. She instantly rose, and as soon as Goodwood saw he was seen, he started forward. She had had only time to rise when, with a motion that looked like violence, but felt like she knew not what, he grasped her by the wrist and made her sink again into the seat. She closed her eyes. He had not heard her. It was only a touch which she had obeyed, but there was something in his face that she wished not to see. That was the way he had looked at her the other day in the churchyard, only at present it was worse. He said nothing at first. She only felt him close to her, beside her on the bench, and pressingly turned to her. It almost seemed to her that no one had ever been so close to her as that. All this, however, took but an instant, at the end of which she had disengaged her wrist, turning her eyes upon her visitant. "You frightened me," she said. "I didn't mean to," he answered, "but if I did a little, no matter. I came from London a while ago by the train, but I couldn't come here directly. There's a man at the station who got ahead of me. He took a fly that was there, and I heard him give the order to drive here. I don't know who he was, but I didn't want to come with him. I wanted to see you alone. So I've been waiting and walking about. I've walked all over, and I was just coming to the house when I saw you here. There was a keeper, or someone, who met me, but that was all right, because I made his acquaintance when I came here with your cousin. Is that gentleman gone? Are you really alone? I want to speak to you." Goodwood spoke very fast. He was as excited as when they had parted in Rome. Isabel had hoped that condition would subside, and she shrank into herself as she perceived that, on the contrary, he had only let out sail. She had a new sensation. He had never produced it before. It was a feeling of danger. There was indeed something really formidable in his resolution. She gazed straight before her. He, with a hand on each knee, leaned forward, looking deeply into her face. The twilight seemed to darken round them. "I want to speak to you," he repeated. "I have something particular to say. I don't want to trouble you, as I did the other day in Rome. That was of no use. It only distressed you. I couldn't help it. I knew it was wrong. But I'm not wrong now. Please don't think I am," he went on with his hard, deep voice melting a moment into entreaty. "I came here today for a purpose. It's very different. It was vain for me to speak to you then, but now I can help you." She couldn't have told you whether it was because she was afraid, or because such a voice in the darkness seemed of necessity a boon, but she listened to him as she had never listened before. His words dropped deep into her soul. They produced a sort of stillness in all her being, and it was with an effort, in a moment, that she answered him. "How can you help me?" she asked in a low tone, as if she were taking what he had said seriously enough to make the enquiry in confidence. "By inducing you to trust me. Now I know. Today I know. Do you remember what I asked you in Rome? Then I was quite in the dark. But today I know on good authority. Everything's clear to me today. It was a good thing when you made me come away with your cousin. He was a good man, a fine man, one of the best. He told me how the case stands for you. He explained everything. He guessed my sentiments. He was a member of your family, and he left you, so long as you should be in England, to my care," said Goodwood, as if he were making a great point. "Do you know what he said to me the last time I saw him, as he lay there where he died? He said, 'Do everything you can for her. Do everything she'll let you.'" Isabel suddenly got up. You had no business to talk about me." "Why not? Why not when we talked in that way?" he demanded, following her fast. "And he was dying. When a man's dying, it's different." She checked the movement she had made to leave him. She was listening more than ever. It was true that he was not the same as that last time. That had been aimless, fruitless passion, but at present he had an idea, which she scented in all her being. "But it doesn't matter," he exclaimed, pressing her still harder, though now without touching a hem of her garment. "If Touchett had never opened his mouth, I should have known all the same. I had only to look at you at your cousin's funeral to see what's the matter with you. You can't deceive me any more. For God's sake, be honest with a man who's so honest with you. You're the most unhappy of women, and your husband's the deadliest of fiends." She turned on him as if he had struck her. "Are you mad?" she cried. "I've never been so sane. I see the whole thing. Don't think it's necessary to defend him. But I won't say another word against him. I'll speak only of you," Goodwood added quickly. "How can you pretend you're not heartbroken? You don't know what to do. You don't know where to turn. It's too late to play a part. Didn't you leave all that behind you in Rome? Touchett knew all about it, and I knew it too. What would it cost you to come here? It will have cost you your life? Say it will," and he flared almost into anger. "Give me one word of truth, when I know such a horror as that. How can I keep myself from wishing to save you? What would you think of me if I should stand still and see you go back to your reward? It's awful what you'll have to pay for it. That's what Touchett said to me. I may tell you that, mayn't I?" "He was such a near relation," cried Goodwood, making his queer grim point again. "I'd sooner have been shot than let another man say those things to me. But he was different. He seemed to me to have the right. It was after he got home, when he saw he was dying, and when I saw it too. I understand all about it. You're afraid to go back. You're perfectly alone. You don't know where to turn. You can't turn anywhere. You know that perfectly. Now it is therefore that I want you to think of me." "To think of you?" Isabel said, standing before him in the dusk. The idea of which she had caught a glimpse a few moments before now loomed large. She threw back her head a little. She stared at it as if it had been a comet in the sky. "You don't know where to turn. Turn straight to me. I want to persuade you to trust me," Goodwood repeated. And then he paused with his shining eyes. "Why should you go back? Why should you go through that ghastly form?" "To get away from you," she answered, but this expressed only a little of what she felt. The rest was that she had never been loved before. She had believed it, but this was different. This was the hot wind of the desert, at the approach of which the others dropped dead, like mere sweet airs of the garden. It wrapped her about, it lifted her off her feet, while the very taste of it, as of something potent, acrid and strange, forced open her set teeth. At first, in rejoinder to what she had said, it seemed to her that he would break out into greater violence. But after an instant he was perfectly quiet. He wished to prove that he was sane, that he had reasoned it all out. "I want to prevent that, and I think I may, if you only for once listen to me. It's too monstrous of you to think of sinking back into that misery, of going to open your mouth to that poisoned air. It's you that are out of your mind. Trust me as if I had the care of you. Why shouldn't we be happy, when it's here before us, when it's so easy? I'm yours forever and ever. Here I stand, I'm as firm as a rock. What have you to care about? You've no children. That perhaps would have been an obstacle. As it is, you've nothing to consider. You must save what you can of your life. You mustn't lose it all simply because you've lost a part. It would be an insult to you to assume that you care for the look of the thing, for what people will say, for the bottomless idiocy of the world. We've nothing to do with all that. We're quite out of it. We will look at things as they are. You took the great step in coming away. The next is nothing. It's the natural one. I swear as I stand here that a woman deliberately made to suffer is justified in anything in life, in going down into the streets if that will help her. I know how you suffer, and that's why I'm here. We can do absolutely as we please. To whom under the sun do we owe anything? What is it that holds us? What is it that has the smallest right to interfere in such a question as this? Such a question is between ourselves, and to say that is to settle it. Were we born to rot in misery? Were we born to be afraid? I never knew you afraid. If you'll only trust me, how little you will be disappointed. The world's all before us, and the world's very big. I know something about that." Isabel gave a long murmur like a creature in pain. It was as if he were pressing something that hurt her. "The world's very small," she said at random. She had an immense desire to appear to resist. She said it at random to hear herself say something, but it was not what she meant. The world, in truth, had never seemed so large. It seemed to open out all round her, to take the form of a mighty sea, where she floated in fathomless waters. She had wanted help, and here was help. It had come in a rushing torrent. I know not whether she believed everything he said, but she believed just then that to let him take her in his arms would be the next best thing to her dying. This belief, for a moment, was a kind of rapture in which she felt herself sink and sink. In the moment, she seemed to beat with her feet in order to catch herself, to feel something to rest on. "Ah, be mine as I'm yours," she heard her companion cry. He had suddenly given up argument, and his voice seemed to come, harsh and terrible, through a confusion of vaguer sounds. This, however, of course, was but a subjective fact, as the metaphysicians say. The confusion, the noise of waters, all the rest of it, were in her own swimming head. In an instant she became aware of this. "Do me the greatest kindness of all," she panted. "I beseech you to go away." "Ah, don't say that! Don't kill me!" he cried. She clasped her hands. Her eyes were streaming with tears. "As you love me, as you pity me, leave me alone." He glared at her a moment through the dusk, and the next instant she felt his arms about her and his lips on her own lips. His kiss was like white lightning, a flash that spread and spread again and stayed, and it was extraordinarily as if, while she took it, she felt each thing in his hard manhood that had least pleased her, each aggressive fact of his face, his figure, his presence, justified of its intense identity, and made one with this act of possession. So had she heard of those wrecked and under water, following a train of images before they sink. But when darkness returned, she was free. She never looked about her. She only darted from the spot. There were lights in the windows of the house. They shone far across the lawn. In an extraordinarily short time, for the distance was considerable, she had moved through the darkness, for she saw nothing, and reached the door. Here only she paused. She looked all about her. She listened a little. Then she put her hand on the latch. She had not known where to turn, but she knew now. There was a very straight path. 2 days after, Caspar Goodwood knocked at the door of the house in Wimpole Street, in which Henrietta Stackpole occupied furnished lodgings. He had hardly removed his hand from the knocker when the door was opened, and Miss Stackpole herself stood before him. She had on her hat and jacket. She was on the point of going out. "Oh, good morning," he said. "I was in hopes I should find Mrs. Osmond." Henrietta kept him waiting a moment for her reply, but there was a good deal of expression about Miss Stackpole even when she was silent. "Pray, what led you to suppose she was here?" "I went down to Gardencourt this morning, and the servant told me she had come to London. He believed she was to come to you." Again Miss Stackpole held him, with an intention of perfect kindness, in suspense. "She came here yesterday and spent the night, but this morning she started for Rome." Caspar Goodwood was not looking at her. His eyes were fastened on the doorstep. "Oh, she started," he stammered, and without finishing his phrase or looking up, he stiffly averted himself. But he couldn't otherwise move. Henrietta had come out, closing the door behind her, and now she put out her hand and grasped his arm. "Look here, Mr. Goodwood," she said. "Just you wait." On which he looked up at her, but only to guess from her face, with a revulsion, that she simply meant he was young. She stood shining at him with that cheap comfort, and it added, on the spot, 30 years to his life. She walked him away with her, however, as if she had given him now the key to patience. End of chapter 55. End of The Portrait of a Lady, Volume 2 of 2, by Henry James.